Glenarvan and the captain, after mature reflection, resolved that the Duncan should follow the western shore, seeking traces of the Britannia, should stop at Cape Bernouilli, where further information could be obtained, and then continue southward to Melbourne, where her injuries could be repaired. And as soon as this was done, that she should cruise along the eastern shores to finish the search. This arrangement was approved, and Captain Mangles resolved to take advantage of the first favorable wind. He did not have to wait long. Towards evening the hurricane had entirely subsided and a moderate breeze was blowing from the southwest. Preparations were made for getting underway, new sails were set, and at 4 o'clock in the morning the sailors heaved at the capstan, the anchor was weighed, and the Duncan, with all sails set, cruised close to windward along the coast. They arrived at Cape Bernouilli without finding the least trace of the lost vessel. But this failure proved nothing. Indeed, during the 2 years since the shipwreck, the sea might have scattered or destroyed the fragments of the brig. Besides, the natives, who scent shipwrecks as a vulture does a corpse, might have carried away every vestige of it. Harry Grant and his 2 companions, therefore without doubt, had been taken prisoners the moment the waves cast them ashore and been carried into the interior of the country. Hoping against hope. But here one of Paganel's ingenious suppositions failed. So long as they were in the Argentine territory, the geographer could rightly maintain that the latitude of the document referred to the place of captivity, not to the scene of the shipwreck. Indeed, the great rivers of the Pampas and their numerous affluents could easily bear the document to the sea. In this part of Australia, on the contrary, few streams cross the 37th parallel, and the principal Australian rivers, the Murray, the Yarra, the Torrens, and the Darling, either flow into each other or empty into the ocean by mouths where navigation is active. What probability was there, then, that a fragile bottle could have descended these continually navigated waters and reached the Indian Ocean? This consideration could not escape such sagacious minds. Paganel's supposition, plausible in Patagonia, was illogical in Australia. The geographer perceived this in a discussion on the subject with the major. It was clear that the latitude applied only to the place of shipwreck, and that consequently the bottle had been cast into the sea where the Britannia was wrecked, on the western coast of Australia. However, as Glenarvan justly observed, this interpretation did not preclude the possibility of Captain Grant's captivity, who, moreover, had intimated as much by the words, "where they will be prisoners of the cruel Indians." But there was no more reason for seeking the prisoners on the 37th parallel than on any other. This conclusion, after much discussion, was finally accepted, and it was decided that, if no traces of the Britannia were found at Cape Bernouilli, Lord Glenarvan should return to Europe, relinquishing all hope of finding the object of their search. This resolution occasioned profound grief to the children of the lost captain. As the boats containing the whole of the party were rowed ashore, they felt that the fate of their father would soon be probably decided. Irrevocably, we may say, for Paganel, in a former discussion, had clearly demonstrated that the shipwrecked seamen would have reached their country long ago, if their vessel had stranded on the other, the eastern coast. A new prospect. "Hope, hope, never cease to hope," said Lady Helena to the young girl seated beside her as they approached the shore. "The hand of God will never fail us." As the boats containing the whole of the party were rowed ashore, they felt that the fate of their father would soon be probably decided. "Yes, Miss Mary," said the captain. "When men have exhausted human resources, then heaven interposes, and by some unforeseen event, opens to them new ways." "God grant it, Captain," replied Mary. The shore was now only a cable's length distant. The cape terminated in gentle declivities extending far out into the sea. The boat entered a small creek, between banks of coral in process of formation, which in time would form a chain of reefs along the southern coast of the island. The passengers of the Duncan disembarked on a perfectly barren shore. Steep cliffs formed a lofty seawall, and it would have been difficult to scale this natural rampart without ladders or cramping irons. Fortunately, the captain discovered a breach half a mile southward, caused by a partial crumbling of the cliffs. Probably the sea, during violent equinoctial storms, had beaten against this fragile barrier, and thus caused the fall of the upper portions of the mass. Glenarvan and his companions entered this opening and reached the summit of the cliffs by a very steep ascent. Robert climbed an abrupt declivity with the agility of a cat, and arrived first at the top, to the great chagrin of Paganel, who was quite mortified at seeing himself outstripped by a mere lad of 12. However, he distanced the peaceable major, but that worthy was utterly indifferent to his defeat. The little party surveyed the plain that stretched out beneath them. It was a vast, uncultivated tract, covered with bushes and brushwood, and was compared by Glenarvan to the glens of the Scottish lowlands, and by Paganel to the barren lands of Brittany. But though the country along the coast was evidently uninhabited, the presence of man, not the savage, but the civilized worker, was betokened by several substantial structures in the distance. "A mill," cried Robert. True enough, at no great distance apparently, the sails of a mill were seen. "It is indeed a mill," replied Paganel. "Here is a beacon as modest as it is useful, the sight of which delights my eyes." "It is almost a belfry," said Lady Helena. "Yes, madam, and while one makes bread for the body, the other announces bread for the soul. In this respect they resemble each other." "Let us go to the mill," replied Glenarvan. They accordingly started. After half an hour's walk, the soil assumed a new aspect. The transition from barren plains to cultivated fields was sudden. Instead of brushwood, quickset hedges surrounded an enclosure freshly plowed. Some cattle, and half a dozen horses, grazed in pastures encircled by acacias. Then fields of corn were reached, several acres of land bristling with the yellow ears, haycocks like great beehives, vineyards with blooming enclosures, a beautiful garden, where the useful and the ornamental mingled. In short, a fair and comfortable locality, which the merry mill crowned with its pointed gable and caressed with the moving shadow of its sails. At this moment, a man of about 50, of prepossessing countenance, issued from the principal house, at the barking of 3 great dogs that announced the coming of the strangers. 5 stout and handsome boys, his sons, accompanied by their mother, a tall, robust woman, followed him. This man, surrounded by his healthful family, in the midst of these new erections, in this almost virgin country, presented the perfect type of the colonist, who, endeavoring to better his lot, seeks his fortune and happiness beyond the seas. Glenarvan and his friends had not yet introduced themselves. They had not had time to declare either their names or their rank, when these cordial words saluted them. "An Australian home. Strangers, welcome to the house of Patrick O'Moore." "You are an Irishman," said Glenarvan, taking the hand that the colonist offered him. "I was," replied Mr. O'Moore. "Now I am an Australian, but come in, whoever you are, gentlemen, this house is at your service." The invitation so hospitably given was accepted without ceremony. Lady Helena and Mary Grant, conducted by Mrs. O'Moore, entered the house, while the colonist's sons relieved the visitors of their firearms. A large, cool, airy room occupied the ground floor of the house, which was built of stout beams arranged horizontally. Several wooden benches, built into the walls and painted in gay colors, 10 stools, 2 oaken trunks, in which white china and jugs of polished pewter were arranged, and a long table at which 20 people could be comfortably seated, constituted the furniture, worthy of the house and its hardy inhabitants. Dinner was soon served. Dishes of soup smoked between roast beef and legs of mutton, flanked by large plates of olives, grapes, and oranges. The host and hostess had such an engaging air, and the fare was so tempting, so ample, and so abundantly furnished, that it would have been unbecoming not to accept this rural bounty. The domestics of the farm, the equals of their master, had already come to partake of the repast, and the host reserved the place of honor for the strangers. "I expected you," said he quietly to Lord Glenarvan. "You did," replied the latter, very much surprised. "I always expect those who are coming," replied the Irishman. Then, in a grave voice, while his household stood respectfully, he invoked a divine blessing. Lady Helena was much affected by his perfect simplicity of manner, and a look from her husband told her that he likewise was touched by it. A fair and comfortable locality, which the merry mill crowned with its pointed gable and caressed with the moving shadow of its sails. The old question. Ample justice was done to the repast. The conversation was general. The colonist told his story. It was like that of most deserving and voluntary emigrants. Many go far to seek their fortunes and find only sorrow and disaster. They accuse fate, forgetting to blame their ignorance, laziness, and vices. The man who is sober and persevering, economical and honest, is almost sure to succeed. This had been the case with Mr. O'Moore. He had left Dundalk, where he was poor, and emigrating with his family to Australia, had landed at Adelaide. At first he engaged in mining, but soon relinquished this for the less hazardous pursuits of the farmer, in which he had been successful beyond his highest anticipations. His agricultural knowledge was a great aid to him. He economized and bought new lands with the profits of the first. His family flourished as well as his farm. The Irish peasant had become a landed proprietor, and although his establishment was only 2 years old, he owned at that moment 500 acres of well-cultivated land and 500 head of cattle, was his own master, and as independent as one can be even in the freest country in the world. His guests congratulated him sincerely when his story was finished. He doubtless expected a similar confidence, but did not urge it. Glenarvan had an immediate interest in speaking of the Duncan, of his own presence at Cape Bernouilli, and of the search that they had pursued so perseveringly. But like a man who considers the main object in view, he first questioned his host concerning the shipwreck of the Britannia. The Irishman's answer was not cheering. He had never heard of the ship. No vessel had for some time been lost on the coast, and, as the shipwreck had occurred only 2 years before, he could affirm with absolute certainty that the sailors had not been cast on that part of the western shore. "And now, my lord," added he, "may I be allowed to ask why you have inquired of me concerning this shipwreck?" Glenarvan then told the story of the document, the voyage of the Duncan, and the attempts made to find Captain Grant. He confessed that his dearest hopes had been destroyed by Mr. O'Moore's discouraging information, and that he now despaired of ever finding the shipwrecked seamen of the Britannia. These words produced a gloomy impression upon his hearers. Robert and Mary listened to them with tearful eyes. Paganel could not find a word of consolation or hope. Captain Mangles suffered a grief that he could not subdue. Despair was seizing upon the souls of the noble people whom the Duncan had vainly brought to these distant shores, when all at once a voice was heard. "My lord, praise and thank God. If Captain Grant is living, he is in Australia." Chapter 31. The Quartermaster of the Britannia. The astonishment that these words produced cannot be described. Glenarvan sprang to his feet, and pushing back his chair, cried, "Who says that?" "I," replied one of O'Moore's workmen, seated at the end of the table. "You, Ayrton," said the colonist, no less astonished than Glenarvan. "I," repeated Ayrton in an excited but firm tone. "I, a Scotchman like yourself, my lord, one of the shipwrecked sailors of the Britannia." "Of fresh face." Mary Grant, half fainting with emotion, and overcome with happiness, sank into the arms of Lady Helena, while Captain Mangles, Robert, and Paganel went towards the man whom their host had called Ayrton. He was a somewhat rough-looking, broad-shouldered man, of about 45, of more than medium height, and with piercing eyes sunk deeply beneath his projecting brows. His strength must have been unusual, even considering his stature, for he was all bone and sinew. His countenance, full of intelligence and energy, although the features were stern, prepossessed one in his favor. The sympathy that he elicited was still more increased by the traces of recent hardships imprinted upon his face. It was evident that he had suffered much, although he seemed a man able to brave, endure, and conquer suffering. The travelers felt all this at first sight. Ayrton's appearance had interested them, and Glenarvan, acting as spokesman for all, pressed him with inquiries. This strange meeting had evidently produced a bewildering effect, and the first questions were, to some extent, without order. "You are one of the sailors of the Britannia?" asked Glenarvan. "Yes, my lord, Captain Grant's quartermaster," replied Ayrton. "Saved with him from the shipwreck?" "No, my lord. At that terrible moment I was washed overboard and cast ashore." "You are not one of the sailors, then, of whom the document makes mention?" "No, I did not know of the existence of such a document. The captain must have thrown it overboard after I was gone." "But the captain. I suppose he was lost, drowned with the rest of the crew. I thought I was the sole survivor." "But you said that Captain Grant was living." "He was a somewhat rough-looking, broad-shouldered man, of about 45. When I was washed from the forecastle, as I was hauling down the jib, the Britannia was driving towards the coast of Australia, which was not 2 cable lengths distant." "No," I said, "if the captain is living." "He is in Australia," you added. "He can be nowhere else." "You do not know, then, where he is?" "No, my lord. I repeat that I thought he was buried in the waves or dashed upon the rocks. You say that perhaps he is still living. What do you know then? Asked Glenarvan. Simply this, that if Captain Grant is living he is in Australia. Where did the shipwreck take place? Inquired the Major. This should have been the first question, but in the excitement of the moment, Glenarvan, anxious to know where Captain Grant was, had not inquired where the Britannia was lost. From this point the conversation assumed a more definite form, and soon the details of the complicated story appeared clear and exact to the minds of Ayrton's hearers. To the Major's question Ayrton replied, "When I was washed from the forecastle, as I was hauling down the jib, the Britannia was driving towards the coast of Australia, which was not 2 cable lengths distant. The shipwreck therefore took place at that point." "In latitude 37, asked Captain Mangles. 37, replied Ayrton. "On the west coast?" "No, on the east coast." "And when?" "On the night of June 27, 1862. The very same," cried Glenarvan. "You see then, my lord," added Ayrton, "that I was right in saying that, if Captain Grant still lives, you must seek him in Australia." "Old memories." "And we will seek, find, and save him, my friend," cried Paganel. "Ah, precious document," added he with perfect simplicity, "it must be confessed that you have fallen into the hands of very sagacious people." No one noticed these flattering words of Paganel. Glenarvan, Lady Helena, Mary, and Robert had crowded around Ayrton, and eagerly clasped his hands. It seemed as if the presence of this man was a guarantee of the safety of Harry Grant. Since the sailor had escaped the dangers of shipwreck, why should not the captain be safe and sound? Ayrton repeated his declaration that if Captain Grant were living, he must be in Australia. He answered with remarkable intelligence and clearness the many questions that were propounded to him. Miss Mary, while he spoke, held one of his hands in her own. This sailor had been a companion of her father, one of the shipwrecked survivors of the Britannia. He had lived with Harry Grant, had sailed the seas with him, had braved the same dangers. She could not withdraw her eyes from that weather-beaten face, and she wept with happiness. Hitherto, no one had thought of doubting the veracity of the quartermaster. Only the Major, and perhaps Captain Mangles, questioned whether Ayrton's story merited entire confidence. This unexpected meeting might be suspicious. To be sure, Ayrton had mentioned facts and dates that agreed, and striking particulars. But details, however exact they may be, do not constitute a certainty, and generally, as we know, falsehood endeavors to strengthen itself by its preciseness. Mac Nab, therefore, reserved his opinion. As for Captain Mangles, his doubts did not stand long before the assertions of the sailor, and he considered him a real companion of Captain Grant when he heard him speak to the young girl of her father. Ayrton knew Mary and Robert perfectly. He had seen them at Glasgow on the departure of the Britannia. He remembered that they had been present at the farewell dinner given on board to the friends of the captain. Sheriff McIntyre was one of the guests. Robert, scarcely 10 years old, had been confided to the care of Dick Turner, the boatswain, but had escaped from him and climbed to the topsail yardarm. When he came to himself, he was in the hands of the natives, who carried him into the interior of the country. At last, exhausted and almost dead, he reached the hospitable dwelling of Mr. O'Moore, where his labor ensured him a comfortable livelihood. It is true," cried Robert. The quartermaster remembered, too, 1,000 little circumstances to which he did not seem to attach so much importance as did Captain Mangles. When he stopped, Mary said in her sweet voice, "Mr. Ayrton, please tell us more about our father." Ayrton acceded to the young girl's request. Glenarvan was reluctant to interrupt him, and yet many more important questions thronged his mind. But Lady Helena, pointing out to him Mary's joyful excitement, checked his inquiries. 2 years of slavery. The quartermaster now told the story of the Britannia and her voyage across the Pacific. During the period of a year, Harry Grant landed at the principal ports of Oceanica, opposing unjustifiable captures, and often a victim to the hostility of unjust traders. He found, however, an important point on the western coast of Papua. Here the establishment of a Scottish colony appeared to him feasible and its prosperity assured. After examining Papua, the Britannia sailed to Callao for provisions, and left that port on the 30th of May, 1862, to return to Europe by the way of the Indian Ocean and the Cape. 3 weeks after her departure, a terrible tempest disabled her. It became necessary to cut away the masts. A leak was discovered in the hold, which they did not succeed in stopping. The crew were soon overtasked and exhausted. The pumps could not be worked. For 8 days the vessel was at the mercy of the storm. There were 6 feet of water in her hold, and she gradually foundered. The boats had been washed overboard, and the crew had given themselves up for lost, when on the night of June 22nd, as Paganel had rightly interpreted, they descried the eastern coast of Australia. The vessel soon stranded. A violent shock was felt. At this moment Ayrton, borne by a wave, was cast into the midst of the breakers and lost all consciousness. When he came to himself, he was in the hands of the natives, who carried him into the interior of the country. Since then he had heard nothing more of the Britannia, and naturally supposed that she had been wrecked with all on board on the dangerous reefs of Twofold Bay. This was Ayrton's story, which elicited more than once exclamations of sympathy. The Major could not justly doubt its correctness, and after this recital, the quartermaster's own experiences possessed a more real interest. Indeed, thanks to the document, they no longer doubted that Captain Grant had survived the shipwreck with 2 of his sailors. From the fate of the one, they could fairly conjecture that of the other. Ayrton was invited to tell of his own adventures, which was soon and simply done. The shipwrecked sailor, prisoner of a native tribe, was carried into the interior regions watered by the Darling. Here he led a very wretched existence, because the tribe itself was miserable, but he was not maltreated. For 2 long years he endured a painful slavery. However, the hope of regaining his liberty sustained his courage. He watched for the least opportunity of escaping, although his flight would plunge him into the midst of innumerable perils. One night in October, he eluded the vigilance of the natives, and took refuge in the depths of extensive forests. For a month, living on roots, edible ferns, and the gum of the mimosa, often overcome by despair, he wandered in those vast solitudes, with the sun as his guide by day and the stars by night. In this way he crossed marshes, rivers, mountains, in short, all that uninhabited portion of country that few travelers have explored. At last, exhausted and almost dead, he reached the hospitable dwelling of Mr. O'Moore, where his labor ensured him a comfortable livelihood. "And if Ayrton is pleased with me," said the Irish colonist, when the story was finished, "I cannot but be pleased with him. He is an honest and intelligent man, a good worker, and if he chooses, this house shall long be at his service." Ayrton thanked Mr. O'Moore, and waited for further questions. He probably thought, however, that the legitimate curiosity of his hearers ought to be satisfied. What could he say that had not been repeated 100 times already? Glenarvan was, therefore, about to open the conversation on a new topic, to profit by the information received from Ayrton, when the Major, addressing him, said, "You were quartermaster of the Britannia." "Yes," replied Ayrton. But perceiving that a certain feeling of distrust, a doubt, however slight, had suggested this inquiry, he added, "I saved my contract from the wreck." He immediately left the room in search of this authoritative document. During his absence, which lasted but a few moments, Mr. O'Moore said, "My lord, I will answer for it that Ayrton is an honest man. During the 2 months that he has been in my employ, I have had no fault to find with him. I knew the story of his shipwreck and captivity. He is a true man, and worthy of your entire confidence." Glenarvan was about to answer that he had never doubted Ayrton's honesty, when the latter returned and presented his contract. It was a paper signed by the owners of the Britannia and Captain Grant, whose writing Mary recognized immediately. It stated that Tom Ayrton, able seaman, was engaged as quartermaster on board the brig Britannia of Glasgow. There was, therefore, no possible doubt of Ayrton's identity, for it would have been difficult to suppose that this contract could be in his hands and not belong to him. Entanglements. "Now," said Glenarvan, "I appeal to you all for advice as to what is best to be done. Your advice, Ayrton, would be particularly valuable, and I should be much obliged if you would give it to us." The sailor reflected a few moments, and then replied, "I thank you, my lord, for the confidence you place in me, and hope to show myself worthy of it. I have some knowledge of the country and of the customs of the natives, and if I can be of use to you—" "Certainly," replied Glenarvan. "I think, like you," continued Ayrton, "that Captain Grant and his 2 sailors were saved from the shipwreck. But since they have not reached the English possessions, since they have not reappeared, I doubt not that their fate was the same as my own, and that they are prisoners of the natives. You repeat, Mr. Ayrton, the arguments that I have already substantiated, said Paganel. The shipwrecked seamen are evidently prisoners of the natives, as they feared, but ought we to suppose that, like you, they have been carried to the north? It is quite likely, sir, replied Ayrton. The hostile tribes would hardly remain in the neighborhood of the English provinces. This fact will complicate our search, said Glenarvan, quite disconcerted. How shall we find the traces of the prisoners in the interior of so vast a continent? A prolonged silence followed this remark. Lady Helena frequently cast a questioning glance at her companions, but without eliciting a responsive sign. Paganel himself was silent, contrary to his custom. His usual ingenuity now failed him. Captain Mangles paced the room with long strides, as if he had been on the deck of his vessel, involved in some difficulty. "And you, Mr. Ayrton," said Lady Helena at length to the quartermaster, "what would you do?" "Madam," replied he promptly, "I should re-embark on board the Duncan, and go straight to the place of the shipwreck. There I should act according to circumstances, or indications that chance might furnish." "Very good," said Glenarvan, "but we must wait till the Duncan is repaired." "Ah, you have suffered injuries?" inquired Ayrton. "Yes," replies the captain. "Serious?" "No, but they necessitate repairs which cannot be made on board. One of the flanges of the screw is bent, and this work can be done only at Melbourne." "Can you not sail?" asked the quartermaster. "Yes, but if the wind is contrary, it would take considerable time to reach Twofold Bay, and at any rate we should have to return to Melbourne." "Well, let the yacht go to Melbourne," said Paganel, "and we will go without her to Twofold Bay." "But how?" "By crossing Australia, as we crossed South America." "But the Duncan," added Ayrton with singular persistency. "The Duncan will join us, or we will join her, according to circumstances. If Captain Grant is found during our journey, we will return together to Melbourne. If, on the contrary, we continue our search to the coast, the Duncan shall join us there. Who has any objections to make to this plan? Have you, Major?" "No," replied Mac Nab, "if it is practicable." "So practicable," said Paganel, "that I propose that Lady Helena and Miss Grant accompany us." "Do you speak seriously, Paganel?" asked Glenarvan. "Quite seriously, my lord. It is a journey of 350 miles. At the rate of 12 miles a day, it would last scarcely a month, long enough to give time for repairing the Duncan." "But the ferocious animals," said Glenarvan, wishing to state all possible objections. "Obstacles explained away." "There are none in Australia." "But the savages?" "There are none in the course we shall take." "Well then, the convicts?" "There are no convicts in the southern provinces of Australia, but only in the eastern colonies." "Mr. Paganel is perfectly right," said O'Moore. "They have all left the southern provinces. Since I have lived on this farm, I have not heard of one." "And for my part, I never met one," added Ayrton. "You see, my friends," continued Paganel, "that there are few savages, no wild beasts, and no convicts. There are not many countries of Europe of which we could say as much. Well, is it agreed?" "What do you think, Helena?" asked Glenarvan. "What we all think," replied she, turning towards her companions. "Forward." Chapter 32. Preparations for the journey. It was not Glenarvan's habit to lose time in adopting and executing a plan. As soon as Paganel's proposal was accepted, he at once resolved that the preparations for the journey should be completed as soon as possible. And what was to be the result of the search? The existence of Harry Grant seemed to have become undeniable, which increased the probabilities of success. No one expected to find the captain exactly on the line of the 37th parallel, but perhaps they would come upon traces of him, and at all events, their course would bring them straight to the scene of the shipwreck, which was the principal point. Moreover, if Ayrton would consent to join the travelers, to guide them through the forests, and to the eastern coast, there was another chance of success. Glenarvan felt the importance of this arrangement, and was therefore particularly desirous of obtaining the services of Captain Grant's companion. He inquired of his host whether he was willing for him to propose to Ayrton to accompany them. Mr. O'Moore consented, though not without regret at losing so good an assistant. "Well, Ayrton, will you aid us in our search for the sailors of the Britannia?" The quartermaster did not answer immediately. He seemed to hesitate for a few moments, but finally, after reflecting, said, "Yes, my lord, I will follow you. And if I do not set you upon the track of Captain Grant, I will at least guide you to the place where his vessel was wrecked." "Thanks," replied Glenarvan. "One question, my lord." "Ask it." "Where will you join the Duncan?" "At Melbourne, if we do not cross Australia, on the eastern coast, if our search is continued so far." "But the captain of the Duncan?" "He will await my orders at Melbourne." "Very well, my lord," said Ayrton. "Rely on me." "I will," replied Glenarvan. The quartermaster was heartily thanked by the travelers. Captain Grant's children lavished upon him their most grateful caresses. All were delighted at his decision, except the colonist, who would lose in him an intelligent and faithful assistant. But he understood the importance that Glenarvan attached to this new addition to his force, and was resigned. He had, moreover, engaged to furnish them with the means of conveyance for the journey, and this business being settled, the party returned on board. Everything was now changed. All hesitation had vanished. These courageous searchers were no longer to wander on blindly. Harry Grant, they believed, had found a refuge on the continent, and each heart was full of the satisfaction that certainty brings when it takes the place of doubt. In 2 months, perhaps, the Duncan would land the lost captain on the shores of Scotland. When Captain Mangles seconded the proposal that they should attempt to cross Australia with the ladies, he supposed that this time he would accompany the expedition. He therefore consulted Glenarvan on the subject, and brought forward various arguments in his own favor, such as his desire to take part in the search for his countrymen, and his usefulness in the undertaking. "One question, John," said Glenarvan. "You have absolute confidence in your mate?" "Absolute," replied he. "Tom Austin is a good sailor. He will take the Duncan to Melbourne, repair her thoroughly, and bring her back at the appointed time. He is a man devoted to duty and discipline, and will never take the responsibility of changing or delaying the execution of an order. You can rely upon him as fully as on myself." "Very well, Captain," replied Glenarvan. "You shall accompany us, for," added he, smiling, "you certainly ought to be present when we find Mary Grant's father." "Ah, my lord," murmured Captain Mangles, with something like a blush upon his swarthy cheeks. "A paliscart." Next day the captain, accompanied by the carpenter and by the sailors loaded with provisions, returned to the farm of Mr. O'Moore, who was to assist him in the preparations. All the family were waiting for him, ready to work under his orders. Ayrton was there, and freely gave them the benefit of his experience. He and his employer were agreed on this point, that the ladies ought to make the journey in an ox cart, and the gentlemen on horseback. The colonist could procure them the animals and vehicle. The vehicle was a cart 20 feet long and covered with an awning, the whole resting upon 4 wheels, without spokes, felloes, or tires. The front wheels were a long way from the hind ones, and were joined together by a rude contrivance that made it impossible to turn short. To the body of the cart was attached a pole 35 feet long, to which 3 pairs of oxen were coupled. The animals, thus arranged, drew by means of a yoke across their necks, to which the bow was fastened with an iron pin. It required great skill to manage this long, narrow, tottering vehicle, and guide the oxen by means of the whip. But Ayrton had served his apprenticeship at O'Moore's farm, and his employer guaranteed his dexterity. Upon him, therefore, devolved the duty of driving. The cart, being without springs, was not very easy, but our travelers were obliged to conform to circumstances as much as they could. As no change was possible in its rude construction, Captain Mangles arranged the interior in the most comfortable manner. He divided it into 2 compartments by a wooden partition. The rear one was designed for the provisions, the baggage, and Mr. Albinet's portable kitchen, while the forward one was reserved exclusively for the ladies. The carpenter converted it into a convenient chamber, covered it with a thick carpet, and furnished it with a dressing table and 2 berths for Lady Helena and Mary Grant. Thick leathern curtains secured privacy, when necessary, and were a protection against the chilliness of the night. In rainy weather the men could find shelter under the awning, but a tent was to serve this purpose at the time of encampment. Captain Mangles succeeded in crowding into this narrow space all that 2 ladies could need, and Lady Helena and Mary Grant did not greatly miss the comfortable cabins of the Duncan. A return visit. As for the men, 7 strong horses were apportioned to Lord Glenarvan, Paganel, Robert Grant, Major MacNab, Captain Mangles, and the 2 sailors, Wilson and Mulready, who accompanied this new expeditionary party. The horses and oxen grazed near at hand and could be easily collected at the moment of departure. The vehicle was a cart 20 feet long and covered with an awning, the whole resting upon 4 wheels, without spokes, felloes, or tires. Having made his arrangements and given his orders to the carpenter, Captain Mangles returned on board with the colonists' family, who wished to pay Lord Glenarvan a visit. Ayrton thought proper to join them, and about 4 o'clock the captain crossed the gangway of the Duncan. Of course, Glenarvan invited his visitors to dinner, and they willingly accepted his return hospitality. Mr. O'Moore was amazed. The furniture of the cabins, the tapestry, the upholstery, and the fancy work of maple and ebony excited his admiration. Ayrton, on the contrary, gave only a secondary attention to these costly luxuries. He first examined the yacht from a sailor's point of view. He explored the hold. He went down into the engine room. He looked at the engine, inquired its effective power and consumption. He visited the coal house, the pantry, and the powder magazine, and took particular interest in the gun room and the mounted cannon. In the forecastle, Glenarvan now had to deal with a man who was a critical judge, as he could see by Ayrton's keen inquiries. At last the quartermaster finished his exploration by inspecting the masts and rigging, and after a few moments of general review said, "You have a fine vessel, my lord." "A good one too," replied Glenarvan. "How many tons burden is she?" 210. "Shall I be greatly mistaken," added Ayrton, "if I say that the Duncan can easily make 15 knots an hour at full speed?" "Say 17, interposed the captain, "and you will be nearer right." 17, cried the quartermaster. "Why then, no man-o'-war, not even the best, could overtake her." "Not one," said the captain. "The Duncan is a real racing yacht, and is not to be beaten in any way." "Not even in sailing?" asked Ayrton. "Not even in sailing." "Well, my lord, and you, captain, accept the compliments of a sailor who knows what a vessel is worth." "Thanks, Ayrton," replied Glenarvan, "and now remain on board, and it will be your own fault if the ship is not all you can desire." "I will think of it, my lord," said the quartermaster modestly. Mr. Albinett now approached, and informed Lord Glenarvan that dinner was ready, and they all adjourned to the saloon. "That Ayrton is an intelligent man," said Paganel to the major. "Too intelligent," growled MacNab, who, without any apparent reason, disliked the looks and manners of the quartermaster. During dinner, Ayrton gave some interesting information concerning Australia, with which he was perfectly familiar. He inquired the number of sailors that Glenarvan intended to take with him in his expedition. When he learned that only 2, Wilson and Mulready, were to accompany them, he seemed astonished. He advised Glenarvan to form his party of the best seamen of the Duncan. He even insisted upon this point, which must have removed all suspicion from the mind of the major. "But," said Glenarvan, "is there any danger in our journey across Australia?" "None," replied Ayrton. "A change of residence." "Well then, let us leave on board as many as possible. There must be men to navigate the Duncan and take charge of her. It is especially important that she should arrive promptly at the place of meeting, which we will appoint hereafter. Let us not, therefore, lessen the crew." Ayrton seemed to appreciate this reason, and no longer insisted. At evening the party separated. Ayrton and O'Moore's family returned to their home. The horses and cart were to be ready the next day, and the travelers were to start at 8 o'clock in the morning. Lady Helena and Mary Grant now made their last preparations, which were short and less minute than those of Jacques Paganel. The geographer passed half the night in unscrewing, cleaning, and screwing on again the lenses of his telescope. He was still asleep the next morning, when the major awoke him early with a loud summons. The baggage had already been conveyed to the farm through the care of Captain Mangles. A boat was waiting for the travelers, and they were not long in embarking. The young captain gave his last orders to Tom Austin, and instructed him above all to await the commands of Lord Glenarvan at Melbourne, and execute them scrupulously whatever they might be. The trusty sailor replied that they might rely on him. In the name of the crew he offered to his lordship their best wishes for the success of the expedition. The boat put off, and a thunder of applause rent the air. In a few moments the party reached the shore, and in no great length of time arrived at O'Moore's farm. Everything was ready. Lady Helena was delighted with her quarters. The immense cart, with its rude wheels and massive timbers, especially pleased her. The 6 oxen yoked in pairs seemed to indicate primeval simplicity and were a novel sight. Ayrton, whip in hand, awaited the orders of his new chief. "I declare," said Paganel, "this is an admirable vehicle, worth all the mail coaches in the world. I know of no better way of traversing the earth than in this style, like mountebanks. A house that moves when you please and stops wherever you please is all you can desire." Ayrton and Olbinett took their places respectively in front and in the rear part of the cart, while Glenarvan, the Major, Paganel, Robert, Captain Mangles, and the 2 sailors mounted their horses. The Mosquito Plains, whose very name describes them, and serves to tell of the tortures that our friends had to encounter. "Monsieur Paganel," replied Lady Helena, "I hope to have the pleasure of receiving you in my parlor." "Madam," replied the geographer, "you do me great honor. Have you chosen a day?" "I shall be at home every day for my friends," replied Lady Helena, smiling. "And you are?" "The most devoted of all," added Paganel gallantly. This exchange of compliments was interrupted by the arrival of 7 horses, all harnessed, driven by one of O'Moore's sons. Lord Glenarvan paid for these new acquisitions, and added many thanks, which the honest colonist seemed to value as highly as the gold and notes which he received. The signal for departure was now given. Lady Helena and Miss Grant seated themselves in their compartment. Ayrton and Olbinett took their places respectively in front and in the rear part of the cart, while Glenarvan, the Major, Paganel, Robert, Captain Mangles, and the 2 sailors, all armed with carbines and revolvers, mounted their horses. A "God bless you" was Mr. O'Moore's parting salute, which was echoed in chorus by his family. Ayrton uttered a peculiar cry and started his long team. The cart moved, the timbers cracked, the axles creaked, and the farm of the honest, hospitable Irishman soon disappeared from view at the turn of the road. Chapter 33. An Accident. Our travelers made tolerably good progress by their new mode of conveyance. The heat was great, but endurable, and the road was quite easy for the horses. They were still in the province of South Australia, and in this part at least the scenery was not of the most interesting character. A succession of small hills, with very dusty tracks, small shrubs, and scant herbage, had to be traversed for several miles, and when these had been passed they reached the Mosquito Plains, whose very name describes them, and serves to tell of the tortures that our friends had to encounter. Both the bipeds and the quadrupeds suffered terribly from the infliction of these flying pests, whom to avoid was impossible. But there was some consolation for the former in the spirits of hartshorn, carried in the medicine chest, which alleviated the pain caused by the sting of those whom Paganel was continually consigning to a place and person whom they would not visit. But shortly, a more pleasant neighborhood was reached, hedges of acacias, then a newly cut and better made roadway, then European imported trees, oaks, olives, and lemons, then a well-kept fence. All these signs told of their approach to Red Gum Station, the home and settlement of an emigrant engaged in the cattle breeding which is the source of so much Australian wealth. It was in itself an establishment of small importance, but to its owners it was a home, and to its visitors on this occasion it was a hotel, as the station generally is to the traveler. Red Gum Station, the home and settlement of an emigrant engaged in the cattle breeding, which is the source of so much Australian wealth. The Major was skillful enough to shoot a very rare bird, a jabiru, or giant crane. This creature was 5 feet high, and its broad, black, sharp conical beak measured 18 inches in length. Glenarvan's party invariably found beneath the roof of these solitary settlers a well-spread and hospitable table, and in the Australian farmer they always met an obliging host. After a night spent at this resting place, the party advanced through a grove, and at evening encamped on the shores of a brackish and muddy lake. Mr. Olbinett prepared supper with his usual promptness, and the travelers, some in the cart and others under the tent, were not long in falling asleep, in spite of the dismal howlings of the dingoes, the jackals of Australia. The next morning Glenarvan and his companions were greeted with a magnificent sight. As far as the eye could reach, the landscape seemed to be one flowery meadow in spring-like luxuriance. The delicate blue of the slender-leaved flax plant mingled with the flaming scarlet of the acanthus, and the ground was clothed with a rich carpet of green and crimson. After a rapid journey of about 10 miles, the cart wound through tall groups of acacias, mimosas, and white gum trees. The vegetable kingdom on these plains did not show itself ungrateful towards the orb of day, and repaid in perfume and color what it received in sunshine.